I've enjoyed taking a little more time myself and studying the nation of Israel, the land, as well as the people. And we're going to start in Genesis chapter 17. Just a brief review, some things that we've talked about in past weeks. And if you've been here once or twice off and on, you've still gotten the main thrust of these lessons, that there is a land God calls his own. There is a people God calls his own. And God chose to give that land to this certain people. And of all the world God could have kept, God picked that one little spot in the Middle East, and he calls it his own, and he gave it to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to the patriarchs. He gave it to them. It's theirs as a gift of God. Everybody else in the country, they took their land from somebody. We just all do that. People fuss, oh man, we took the land. Everybody took the land from somebody. And, before the Indians came to America, there were Europeans here, and they ran them off and chased them. But no, I don't know. I have no idea where. We're such a silly bunch of people. Not us. It's the liberals everybody's got an agenda about things. But I'm going to try and stay off of other agendas and get on my own. But God's got that piece of dirt. We're going to look at it. Genesis chapter 17. It'll take a while to get through this, so I got to hurry just a little. But if you look at Genesis 17 down at verse 20, well, let's go to verse 19. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant. Now here's the important thing, the covenant. God is going to establish a covenant with somebody. I will establish my covenant with him for what kind of covenant? Everlasting. This is not a temporary, this is not a part-time, this thing is forever. What God is about to promise is a forever thing. And I will establish my covenant with him, as with Isaac, for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. So this is Isaac and Jacob's 12 sons, and on from there. And verse 20, as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Well, what happened earlier when God said Abraham and Sarah were going to have a baby, Abraham said, oh, I'm too old to have a baby crying around the house. Just bless Ishmael. And God said, all right, I can bless Ishmael. So verse 20, as for Ishmael, I've heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, and his counterpart, Ishmael, had 12 sons. Now, just a quick comparison here. If you want to read about this, Esau and Jacob and Ishmael and Isaac, you can read in Romans and in Galatians. But let me just give you a quick thing. First, we've got Abraham. He is the one that God called to start the nation of Israel. Then you've got his son Ishmael over here. God did not give Abraham and Sarah a baby for a long time. And so they were down in Egypt. They picked up a handmaid named Hagar, an Egyptian gal. And she's there. And Sarah, as ladies are men, ladies are not men. As ladies are, men, remember, ladies want to get things done. They want to see something happen. They are not good at, you ask a man, what are you thinking about? And he says nothing. He means it. You ask a lady, and she's lying because she is thinking about something. You may not want to know, she may not want to tell you, but men can think about nothing for great periods of time, and that's why men like fishing more than women, because they can just look and nothing, just nothing, and it's an enjoyable spot to be in their nothing box. But anyhow, so over here, Sarah wanted a baby, couldn't get a baby, so she says to Abraham, go into my maid Hagar, and I will get a child from him. Now let me just explain something. There is our way of doing things, and there's God's way of doing things. And when we push to get our way, it always turns out worse. It just does. When we push to do it in our own strength, or when we push because we want it now. I want this thing now. I want to get married now. I want to forget school. I had one of our girls, about 16. She's in the office, and when she said one day, she said, Pastor, why can't I just be done with school and get married? And she was very earnest and sincere and a good girl. And I wanted to say, because you're an idiot, and if a guy would marry you, he'd be an idiot. And there'll be two idiots getting married, and we don't need any more idiot couples getting married. But anyway, but that's what we do. We get frustrated. Why do I need to take this classes? Why do I need to do this? Why can't I just be rich now instead of working my way up to it? And you know what? If you get rich easy, it's going to ruin you. That's why you don't dump all your money on your kid. If you have much money, give it to God's work. Give it to missions. Give it to the church. You dump it on your kid, and it's probably going to ruin them. Give your kid $10 a week for the rest of their life and let them work for the rest. But anyhow, whatever you want to do is up to you. But so Sarah wanted a baby, and of course it did not turn out well. And they had Ishmael over here. This is the child of the flesh. This is the child, I did it my way. This is for you that are older. This is Frank Sinatra's way over here, okay? They did it their way. And they got that baby. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with Ishmael. There's nothing, Ishmael, he fathered the Arab race. He brought Islam into existence. But you don't read anything bad about Ishmael in the Bible that I know of. He came back, buried his father, but he had 12 sons. Now, on the other side, you've got Isaac. Isaac was called the child of promise. In their old age, Abraham and Sarah had a baby, and that child was a child of promise, a child that God gave miraculously. God did it in his own time. Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that are under the law. God's got a timetable. And don't panic. You don't have to go to college right now. You don't have to graduate right now. You don't have to get married right now. You don't have to get a career right now. You should stay close to God. You should do right now. You should do that every single day of the year. But don't panic. God's got a timetable, and he'll walk you through these things. And so here is the child of promise. That's Isaac. Here's the child of the flesh. And I don't mean evil, sinful flesh. I just mean unwise, I did it my way flesh. And so Ishmael's born over here, and Isaac's born over here. Ishmael, get the promise we just read. He got a promise of being a great nation. Ishmael received the promise he's going to have 12 sons, and they're all going to become dukes if you read about it later on. Now, what's better than having 12 dukes in your family, right? All these important dukes. And this is a good guy, basically, and a good life. Nothing wrong with it. But this son, he got the covenant. This son got the promise covenant. He got the land. He got the Messiah. He got the promise of God's hand of blessings on his future. This son was the spiritual one, the one that was going to receive the blessing of God's design for all of eternity was going to come through this child of promise. And so that's very significant we're looking at here. And so look at verse 21 again. He says, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear to thee at this set time next year. Now, if you want to go back a chapter to chapter 16, you'll see the prophecy before Ishmael's born to chapter 16 and verse 12. We've got Isaac, the child of the Spirit, the child of promise, and then Ishmael, that one, the child of the, I did it my way. Chapter 16, and look down at verse 12. I'm in the wrong chapter. And he shall be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. Now, God makes it's not just about Ishmael. This is about Ishmael's family. This is about what the future holds for Ishmael, his children, his grandchildren, and he certainly gave birth to a race of wild men, and everybody's against, and he is against, and boy, the battles that have been fought, it's not just recent. We're not just talking about terrorists since since 9/11. We're talking about trouble since the Crusades and before, the difficulties all the way back into the Old Testament days. Now, just real quick, you got that first picture of the world up there? Yeah, I think it's the whole world, whatever it is. If I can just give you a quick illustration here. We're going to do some Bible, some history, and then we're going to go back to the Bible. I think this one's brighter, so I'll look over at this one. So right here in the middle, that little chunk of white in there, that's not even all Israel. Israel's this one left-hand side there. That's Israel. The green, over here is green. all the way Indonesia, Malaysia. Mrs. Lopez, that's home for you, right? She's from down there, Malaysia, Indonesia. All the green, that all the way down here in southeastern Africa, Somalia, over here on the west of Africa. That's all where Ishmael's kids live. That's pretty incredible. These are countries, there's 67 countries basically, and of course that changes year to year, depends on whether you're reading a book that I'm reading printed 8 years ago or a book written today. But as of the writing I was reading this week, 67 Muslim nations. Basically the country declares itself Muslim, and the vast majority, 90% or whatever, the people are Muslim, and the rest are in prison, or they don't have their hands or their head or whatever. So all of this, and this little spot here, not all the white, just this little spot on the far left-hand side is where Israel is. And God said to Ishmael, Ishmael's going to be blessed. He's going to be great. He's going to have a great children. Muhammad is, I think he was descended from the second of Ishmael's son, maybe the third, I forget. But he could trace his lineage back. Muhammad, or Ishmael, when they grew up, Ishmael went over here to the Saudi Arabia area, and he lived there. Isaac lived over here. Again, they weren't worlds apart, and it wasn't the Jews hating the Arabs in those days. They were brothers. And you read through Genesis, and when Abraham died, Ishmael joins Isaac in burying his father. But we'll leave this picture there just for a minute. I want you to notice, this is, obviously we're missing the United States over here to the left, and we're missing some of South America. But this is the vast majority. We got 1 billion people in China, 1 billion people in India, and this 1040 window that you hear missionaries talk about, that is from this line right here to this line right here, and the vast majority of the unsaved people in the world are right there, and they're not only unsaved, they're unchurched, they're unreached. There's unsaved people all over America, but they could hear the gospel if they wanted it. They could go to church without any fear of their life. They could pick a Bible up in a thrift store or a grocery store, most any bookstore in the community. But this 1040 window here, and you know what? God loves them. And those people matter. And you know, when missionaries first started going to the world, they didn't worry about going and dying. They worried about other people dying and no one going. There's definitely a mental change that's taken place in the last 100 years. And you go back to the 1800s and the 1700s and before that, missionaries left Europe, left England. You've heard the stories of missionaries throughout the years. Missionaries left America, and to pack up and go to Africa was common. To go and bury your spouse, to bury your children. For Mary Slessor over here in West Africa, she packs up and never marries. She spends her life as a single lady and became a political figure. She became a great reformer of culture, and you know, bright red hair, freckle face, fair skinned girl working in Africa. And most of the missionaries stayed on the coast, and she'd go all the way inland and working with the villages and standing between tribal wars going on and meeting with tribal chiefs and bringing about peace. This area, somebody should care. God cared enough to send his son there and to let him die for us. And just the green, I want you to picture, these are the descendants of Ishmael, and very, very controlled people, a people without freedom, and a people who need Christ. We'll look at that in a minute. You can leave that up there for the moment. All that to say, God promised to bless Ishmael, which he has done, and God promised the covenant to Isaac. And often what we see as earthly prosperity is not spiritual prosperity. I know you look at the Jews, if you were here last week, I talked about it, the number of Jewish millionaires, the number of Jewish people of influence, the number of Jewish people who won Nobel Prizes are like 40 to 1, Jew over Muslim. But another thought, I missed this one. You look at these Muslim-based countries, they're so poor. Islam does not help people. By the way, you could do the same map and pick Catholic-dominated countries. and they're just as poor. It's just a sad, sad thing that wrong religion leaves people destitute and hurting. And not to be critical, we are blessed, and I think we're blessed. Look at our cars and our houses and how good God's been to us. But boy, if we don't give faithfully to missions, there's something wrong with us. I think we don't give faithfully to the church, something's wrong with us. The idea that God would allow me to be a part of, and by the way, we met budget again Sunday, and we're in July, and praise the Lord for that, and thank you for your faithfulness. But these are poor people. These are destitute people, and a government overthrows, all kinds of suffering. But God did bless Ishmael, but He gave the land, and He gave the covenant and the land and the promise to Isaac's seed. All right, now let me just give you some history, and then we'll look again at the map. The idea of anti-Semitism, we're against the Jews. There's nothing new with that, and most times when we think about it, like if you go to Washington, D.C., there's a Holocaust museum. There's one in L.A., I was told. I've not seen it, but I've heard about it. And it's a little gruesome, but I think it's worth you bringing your family to. I think it'd probably be good for dad or mom to go first and see if you want your children to go there. But we should not forget the Holocaust. But, as I said last week, Stalin killed far more Jews than Hitler did. But he was killing all kinds of people. But we can go way, way back beyond that. Remember Haman in the book of Esther. Haman wanted to kill all the Jews. And here the Jews are still going, and Haman's been dead a long time. But Haman in the book of Esther, he said, I'm going to wipe out the Jewish people. Well, number one, you're wrong. And number two, you're wrong. You're wrong thinking you're going to wipe the Jews out. And it was a very stupid choice to make. And he had so much available. But anti-Semitism, let me give you some history here. And if you're newer to our church, please don't be offended. This is history. You can look it up. If truth, I heard somebody today on the news say, the most offended, the people who offend people the most are those with the most facts. That facts tend to be very offensive, especially in a culture very feeling-oriented. I'm prefacing this. Are you ready? You're getting your cushion on, and put your helmet on, and get your binky out. Early Catholic writers, people 300, 400, 500 AD, labeled Jews Christ killers. That was in their writings. You can read it up. And yes, the Jews did kill Christ, but the early Catholic Church had a passionate hatred for Jewish people. Now, you don't hear that today, but it's a reality. And there was no end to the suffering that Jews faced at the hand of Catholics. If you want to go to the Dark Ages and go from the 500s all the way up to the 12 and 1300s, you're going to find, like the Crusades. The Crusades started, and before they even got down to Israel, the Crusaders started up here in England and France, in this area, and some in Germany. They went all across Germany and France, started up here at the direction of the Pope. They went to France and Germany, and they killed over 10,000 Jews just because they were Jews. And that 10,000 Jews, that was at the beginning of the Crusades. The Crusaders were nothing more than people who had a chance to get land and money and hopefully Jerusalem for the Catholic Church. Tragedy beyond tragedy. Pope Urban II, he promoted robbery, abuse, and death to Jews. As the Crusaders were headed out on their crusades, the Pope stood up and pronounced a pre-sin forgiveness to all the Crusaders. And he said, you can look this up, it's as real as it can be. He said, whatever sins you commit against the Jews, I am pardoning you now. And he promoted rape and murder and theft and every kind of vile and corrupt thing imaginable. In 1099 AD, the Crusaders had gotten to Jerusalem, and a bunch of Jews, almost 1,000, 969 Jews found their way into a real strong synagogue and had barred the doors, and they felt they were safe. No one could get in there. And the Crusaders circled the building and started bringing all the burnt, flammable things they could and stuffing everything they could flammable, any cracks, any windows, wherever. And they set that building on fire. That was made of stone. They were able to burn the building, and the Crusaders marched around that building, that synagogue, as they burned alive almost 1,000 Jewish people for one thing. They were Jews. The anti-Semitism has been alive as long as the devil is alive. And when God set that nation apart for himself, the devil went to work. 500 years. By the way, sometimes you hear of Jews who are not real fond of Christianity and crosses and all that. If you went through all that the Jews did at the hands of Crusaders, and of course they all had crosses and religious, and you might not be so pro-cross and all that stuff either. But 500 years before Hitler was ever born, the Jews were ordered to death by the Catholic Church and the Pope. The Catholic Church, 500 years before Hitler came around, the Catholic Church in Europe told the Jews they had to wear badges that identified them as Jewish, or they had to wear certain clothing that identified them as Jewish, so it was better able to decide who to serve, who to not serve, where they could live, where they couldn't live. And if you wanted to beat somebody, you were always free to beat up a Jew. Hitler did nothing new when he made the Jews wear the Star of David on their arm. He just resurrected laws that had been present in Europe for 500 years before he was born. So the anti-Semitic teaching, the anti-Semitic thinking is not a 20th century or even a 19th century thing. This has gone on. Let me just read a couple of quotes about the reformers. Now let me just do this. Let me have that other picture, Josiah. For those of you who are newer, bear with me, just you that know this. And I know you can't read any of this. Read all that, memorize it, you'll be tested in 5 minutes. So Dark Ages, they put from about 500 up to about 1600, this 1,000, 1,100 years. But what this is basically a church development chart, a timetable. Now, this is out of the book called The Trail of Blood. You can still get it. It may be the best-selling, longest-lived little pamphlet on Baptist history you'll ever find. But this map, and it's still available, and you can even, I think you can find it online. I got this online, and I think the whole book's there. But anyway, this is the time of Jesus during the first 100 years or so. And up here, somewhere around 300, most people say the Catholic Church began. And there's some variation on it, but somewhere around 300. Some say it was Constantine in 313, but it doesn't really matter. It's in that area. That's when this map dates and documents when things were invented. Infant baptism was first introduced around 300, but it wasn't common until you get way up to the time of Luther. They were immersing babies for years and years. They weren't just sprinkling them. But anyway, so here's the Catholic Church, and around here there was a split between the Greek Orthodox. Just like anybody else, they get fussy with each other. Then a bunch of them said, we're going to go over to Constantinople and we're going to have our own Catholic Church. That's called the Greek Orthodox. And then the other group was in Rome, and so that's called the Roman Catholic. So this split here, there's the Roman Catholic Church and there's the Greek Orthodox Church. And I've been around the Greek Orthodox people. They're like Catholics with a lot more ritual and a lot more ornate stuff, but still it's all about work salvation. You never know if you're saved. Now, so we're going to follow the Roman Catholic Church here, and this is around 1200 when these things start happening. There are some people that are born, John Wycliffe, John Huss, and some people start fussing. This group of names in here, these are all people who were Catholics. They were Catholic priests, most of them, very educated, and they got frustrated. You've heard of Luther's 95 Theses he nailed on the wall at the Diet of Worms. Those were 95 frustrating things. He was angry at the Catholic Church for this, for this, for this, for this. Now, let me explain. He was not pro-Bible, pro-religion, pro-freedom. He just wanted to be in control. He didn't want to be under the thumb of the Pope. He wanted everybody to be under his thumb. We'll get to Luther in a minute. But in this era, the Reformation started. Now, reform. There's a bunch of these people who said, we want to reform Catholicism. And so people started following Luther. They were called Lutherans. And so they followed these different people. And out of the Reformation, as they were reforming, you got somewhere right around in here, you got a meeting where the Catholics realized we're going to have to give in to some of these people and try and make some kind of peace. And they had this big meeting of some of the Protestant leaders. They weren't called Protestant until this meeting. And they got together, and the term was coined, these people are protesting us running them. And out of that meeting came the term Protestant. And so anybody who was in the Roman Church who protested and wanted to have their own church, they became Protestants. We got the Church of England, and we got the Congregational Church, and the Presbyterian Church, and the Lutheran Church, and all these different churches. The Methodist churches came in a little bit later, through Wesley's and that. These people were once all Catholics. Now, on the bottom, you can't see it, but this is a red line here. If you see it on the real map, all the red, these are all documented murders of God's people. Mostly Bible-believing Baptists or people very close to that, and there's a dozen different names they were called by. But this line down here is the Anabaptists, the trail of blood, and this group of people, and they are there. Every one of those red dots are people that you can document historically and trace. Up here, around 1200 or 1300, see, one thing good about Baptist history is the Catholics write things down. Baptists don't. We're a bunch of knuckleheads. We don't write anything down. But Catholics do. And when they were murdering someone, they're burning somebody, they have some scribe writing down everything he said. And that's the whole book called Martyr's Mirror. 1,600 pages of stories of martyrs. It's probably 80% of it is Catholic written about the murder of Baptists. And so right in here, a Catholic priest, and you can still find it, he said, the Baptists are a strange people. They have been providing us martyrs for over 1,000 years. That was in here. He said over 1,000 years the Baptists have been providing martyrs to the Catholics. And I just think, who could even say something like that? It's like providing us lunch meat, free health care for whoever. But anyhow, so all of this to say, we've got these people. Now, right in here, we got a guy named Savonarola. Some of these people, they stepped up. They didn't like what was going on, and they were rebelling against the Catholic Church. Savonarola, they burned to death in the town square, right in front of everybody. That's what they think of his rebellion. The Catholic Church did. Well, along came John Calvin here in the 1500s, and Ulrich Zwingli a little bit before John Calvin. And Martin Luther, 1480 to 15. These three are the biggest. Zwingli, Calvin, and Luther are the three biggest named Protestants. Now understand, and if you've been here, we've taught on Baptist history before, those three men are responsible for murdering more Bible-believing people than anybody else in history. They murdered them. I mean, there's a lot of people killing Bible believers, but those three are the worst. Let me give you a few things, because we're talking about anti-Semitism. Hitler said that Martin Luther was one of his heroes. Hitler said, "I do insist on the certainty that sooner or later, once we hold power," so this is Hitler's in the rise. Hitler said, "Christianity will be overcome, and the German church, without a pope and without a Bible." He said, we're going to get rid of the church, the pope, and the Bible. And he said, and Luther, if he could be with us, would give us his blessings. That's out of a speech in 1942, Hitler's speeches, and even the page number. Here's a quote from Martin Luther. You see, we've got a group of crazies in America. I mean, there's a lot of crazies in America. We've got some knot-headed young adults who were raised in good churches who are starting to make these guys, Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, their heroes. They're reading their books. They're following their doctrine. I was talking to a young man I know, not from our church, but a good young man in another part of the country. He said, Brother Goddard, I'm sitting at this coffee shop with these guys, and they're talking about how they really are getting some great Reformed theology reading Calvin. And one of them is thinking of baptizing his baby. Now, that's either a product of an absolutely simplistic, ignorant person, or a person who's got way, way, way wrong teaching going on, and probably a guy who never learned Baptist history. John Bunyan, right here, in the 1600s, he's sitting in the jail with 500 to 600 other dissenters, most of them Baptists, but there were others, Quakers, and they lumped them all as dissenters. They dissented. They were against the Church of England. They wouldn't take a license. Bunyan spent 20 years in prison there in England. It's this era when we got our King James Bible, but right before that, we've got Calvin and Luther and Zwingli murdering these people. And these are some things, here's just a couple of things, and there's a whole lot of this. Luther said, if we wish to find a scapegoat on whose shoulders we may lay the miseries, I'm sorry, this is not Martin Luther. This is about Martin Luther. If we wish to find a scapegoat on whose shoulders we may lay the miseries which Germany has brought upon the world, not perhaps a very scientific way of writing history, but I am more and more convinced that the worst evil genius of that country is not Hitler or Bismarck or Frederick the Great, but Martin Luther. And that is a historian in that era. Another quote, there is very little to be said for this coarse, foul-mouthed leader of a revolution. It is a misfortune for humanity that he appeared just at the crisis in the Christian world, meaning the time the Reformation was about to take place. Even our burly defender of the faith was not a worse man and did far less mischief. We hope that the next swing of the pendulum will put an end to Luther's influence in Germany. Another famous historian in that same era, the Archbishop of Canterbury, said it's easy to see how Luther prepared the way for Hitler. Luther hated Jews. Martin Luther, this so-called hero of the faith. Now, don't be mad at me. I'm just reading historical writings. This is a tract like this. Here's a gospel tract, Bible verses, things about our church. This is a tract I'm about to read from, written by Martin Luther, called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. After Luther found out that the Jews wouldn't join him in fighting Catholicism, he just started fighting them too. Luther said in this tract, he outlined 7 ways to deal with the Jews. Number 1, burn their synagogues. Number 2, destroy their homes. Number 3, take away any prayer books. Next, take away any of the copies of the Talmud or the teachings of the rabbis. Next, prevent any Jews from traveling anywhere. Next, steal all their possessions. Next, condemn them to a life of hard labor. That was Martin Luther's view of how to handle the influence of Jews on Germany. He summarized this lengthy tract, that was just a few words out of it. He summarized this lengthy tract by saying, may we be free from this insufferable, devilish burden called the Jews. These reformers were not men you should follow. When I was in college, we were told if you want to read the biographies of men for their character or their passion, and learn from some of their things, but never read their doctrine. The reformers were violent, bloody, hateful, slavish, absolutely the most wicked of religious leaders the world has ever known. They did as much or more than the Catholic Church ever did, and you've heard some of that before. When Hitler signed the treaty with Vatican and Rome, he said, I am only continuing the work of the Catholic Church. Hitler's first large-scale Nazi program was consummated, or it was begun on the anniversary of Martin Luther's birthday to honor him. and could I just say this, Baptists never persecuted Jews nor anybody else. Catholics and Reformers have been vicious against the Jews, vicious beyond words. And so we've got back here, the persecution of the Jewish people was heavy in here, and when the Roman Catholic Church started splitting into these other religions, the persecution just continued. And the Baptist persecution was going on. It wasn't just Lutheran, it wasn't just Jews being persecuted. It was basically anybody who would do this. This book is our book, and we don't care what you think. And that causes trouble. That causes huge, huge problems. And so all that to say that this world of anti-Semitism, boy, it's been going on for generations, and how in the world the Jews are ever where they are today, it's only an act of God. One quick statement, clear back in the early days, there's something called replacement theology that started back in here. Augustine and others began teaching it. Replacement theology is this. It says there was a group of people called the Jews. They had all these promises from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all these promises that went on. But at Calvary, when the Jewish people killed God's son, God took the Jew, tossed him in the trash can, and he picked up the church and put the church in as a replacement for the Jew. And as of the time of Calvary on, the church is now God's chosen people, and we are now those who have all the promises of the covenants. And because of that, you get all these crazy doctrines like we're going to go through the tribulation, which is absolute heretical nonsense. I had somebody wanted to join our church, said, as long as you believe we're going through the tribulation, you can attend our church. You can't join our church. You join our church, you're going to end up teaching Sunday school, dating one of our guys or girls, or being in leadership. We're not doing that. The tribulation is called the time of Jacob's trouble, not the church's trouble. You'll see in a minute the difference, some of the difference here at the end. But I am going somewhere. You may think I'm rambling, but I'm just about to get to the sermon. We're no way in the world. You've got to, what happens with this thing called, and some of you are thinking, I don't get this. It's okay. Hear it over and over and over, and down the road you'll get it. Replacement theology is like dominoes. You throw the Jews out and put the Christians in, it doesn't just topple. It topples this and this and this and this. And you lose the security of the believer. You lose heaven. You end up in the tribulation. You end up an amillennialist and all kinds. You end up a complete crazy person. And then pretty soon you end up being a lawbreaker in America because you don't think we should keep laws. Now, with all that said, turn over to Jeremiah chapter 31. We're going to have to hurry. If you can't keep up with the scriptures, then just listen or write the references down, or get a copy of my afternoon Bible study handout. There's 2 on my chair because all these verses are in my handout, because those people are better. I don't know why they get one and you don't, but anyway, I've got 2 left over. Jeremiah chapter 30. I'm going to look at several verses quickly with you. The lesson tonight is on the end of all nations. And we can go back, Josiah, to that big world map. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 11. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee, though I make a full end of what? See that? Of all nations. Jeremiah 30, verse 11. Though I make an end of all, a full end of all nations. Whether I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. Now, God's going to punish the Jew. You can bet on that. But he's got a different plan for the nations. Go over to the book of Joel. You're in Jeremiah, and then you go to Lamentations, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. So the second book of your minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos. Look at Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3. In fact, why don't you flip the lights on the front here, and then we'll look at that map at the end. Joel chapter 3, it'll help people who've got Bibles. I've got a light up here and you don't. Joel chapter 3, look at verse 2. I will also gather, what? All nations. I will gather all nations and will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, we talked about this verse a few weeks ago. That's the valley of Megiddo, Armageddon, the story of the final battle. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to span a whole lot of end times, of eschatology. And so some of you that know it all, none of us know it all, but you that know a lot about it, have mercy. I'm going to lump it all into one big picture, and I do know that I'm doing that just for the sake of time and order, because I've got one point I want to make. Verse 2, I'll gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people. So he's going to bring all the nations and he's going to plead with them there for his people, for his heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. They have cast lots for my people. Look, he says, just flip this front light off, Don. God says, I'm gonna gather all these nations right there. Like, I don't know if it's gonna be United Nations or whoever, but he says, I'm going to gather all these nations together. Remember last week we looked at the 6-day war? Well, those were all the local nations coming at Israel. The battle of Megiddo, it's going to be huge. The armies of the world are going to be gathered all. And you say, how could that happen? It can happen. You wait. We're going to get to see it. It'll be awesome. All right, flip the lights back on. I will gather all nations. Why? For my people and for my heritage Israel. Because God still, we're talking about way at the end of the age, end of the world, they're still his people. And he's going to gather all these people together at the valley of Megiddo. And look, and I will pour. I'm sorry, I got off that verse. Look over to Zephaniah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Zephaniah. You can find it. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. You know where Nahum preached? Same place Jonah did. Habakkuk, Zephaniah. All right, Zephaniah. Look at Zephaniah chapter 3. These are all books you never read. Zephaniah chapter 3. Some of the neatest prophetic events are outlined in these minor prophets. And it's not the end of the world because preachers don't know them all that well either. I just studied this. Zephaniah chapter 3, look down at verse 8. Therefore, wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. You ever see a cat stalking something in your backyard? I just think cats are, I know some of you are cat haters. I think cats are awesome. And they should not be in the house, but they are great. You watch them stalking a gopher or a bird. You say, oh, birds are pretty. Oh, birds are great to eat if you're a cat. But you watch them stalking, rising up to the prey. And God says, wait on me till the day that I rise up to the prey. I'm in verse 8. For my determination, I am determined to gather the nations. Notice again the nations. Each one of these verses, he's gathering the nations or he's gathering the kingdoms. That I may assemble the kingdoms. Why is he going to assemble them? Well, we read in Joel chapter 3, he's going to assemble them all to the valley of Megiddo or to the valley of Jehoshaphat. We read in Jeremiah 30, he's going to make a full end of all nations. And here in Zephaniah 3:8, all talking at the same time, same place, he says, he said, wait on me and watch me rise up to the prey for my determination, or I'm determined to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms. I'm going to put them all together, the end of verse 8, to pour upon them my indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. You want to compare that over to Peter, where he says, the heavens and the earth shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with a fervent heat. And seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought we to be? Look, God is going to dissolve and burn up these nations. They have had enough time being mean to his people. And God's not going to let it happen anymore. There's a day coming. I remember watching my cousins. I had 3 cousins, Mike, Jamie, and Ronnie, and they were rough. They were really rough. Our home was not a good saintly home, but they were rough compared to us. They were always fighting. I watched one chase his brother down the street with a butcher knife one day, and they were always doing something way, way off the edge. And I was with him one day, and the littlest Ronnie, he was in a fight with some kid, and the kid started to get the better. And I'd watch the bigger ones beat up the little one, and the little one scream and cuss and, attack the others. But he was losing in a fight, and one of the older ones went over and just wham, kicked this guy in the side, knocked him right off. I looked at him, you're the one usually beating him up. He said, yeah, I just want to even it up. It's different. I can beat my kid brother up, but I don't want you beating my kid brother up. And God may punish Israel, but you read through the prophets and you'll see for 3 transgressions and for 4 of this kingdom, and 3 transgressions and 4 of this kingdom. And he lists the kingdoms that took advantage of the Jews. And he said, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead. They're his people. I'm going somewhere. Follow me. I'm going to shoot. You're going to get in the story in a minute. Isaiah chapter, you don't have to turn here. Go back to Jeremiah chapter 33. But in Isaiah 40, write this down, Isaiah 40:15. As far as this whole big map of all these countries, you know what God says in Isaiah 40 verse 15? He says, behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket. You want to know how important America is? Blink. Want to know how important Brazil is? Blink. Now, you're important because you're his child. Your family's important because you love him. But this country, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all nations that forget God. And we are so blessed that something God saw in America. Could have been a bunch of praying grandmas in a rest home. I have no idea what it's done, but for whatever reason, he's preserved us for the little space of grace. Now you're looking there at Jeremiah chapter 33. Look there with me in verse 7. Jeremiah 33:7. And I will cause the captivity of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, and the captivity of Israel, it's the northern kingdom, to return. Now he's not talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel and all those guys after the 70-year captivity, because look at what he says. And will build them as at the first, and verse 8, and I will cleanse them from all their iniquity. God hadn't done that yet. I mean, they killed his son. They certainly got some issues. He's talking about the same time we're talking about at the end, during what I would say blurring after the rapture. We'll just leave it at that. He says in the middle of verse 8, I will pardon their iniquities, whereby they have sinned and whereby they have transgressed against me. And it shall be to me a name of joy and praise and an honor before all the nations of the earth. Don't stop. Hold your finger there. God says all the nations are going to see me pardon my people. And I'm going to gather them together and I'm going to cleanse them. And the whole world is going to see how wonderful these people are. But look at the end of verse 9. Which shall hear of all the good that I do unto them, and they shall fear and tremble for all the goodness and for all the prosperity that I procure unto it. Remember, we don't have time to turn there in Matthew. Jesus said he's going to gather the nations and divide them as a shepherd, the sheep from the goats. And that has to do with how they treated Israel. I was in prison, you visited me, and I was hungry and you fed me. And thank God we've got a president who's pro-Israel. That is huge, huge, huge. And you can look at Revelation 28 when you get time later. It says that the devil was released after 1,000 years, and he's released loose for a while. And it says he shall go to deceive the nations. And we're talking about the nations of the world being deceived. And then we're talking about the nations of the world being gathered. And then God pouring his wrath on the nations of the world. One more verse, if you can find Zechariah. All right? If you're in Zephaniah or Jeremiah, wherever you are, find Zechariah. It's somewhere in those minor prophets, okay? Right after Haggai, before Malachi. Zechariah chapter 14. I love this because it's so exciting to think we're going to be there. This is the end, I think. Unless God gives me another verse. Zechariah chapter 14. Look at Zechariah 14. And look at verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh. And that phrase, the day of the Lord, that can span an awful lot of time. So don't narrow that down to one tiny little window. The day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee, for I will gather all nations. Notice again, we thought you know what God talks about? You've heard this week after week. There's Israel, and then what? All the nations. There's Israel and all the nations. There's Israel and there's all the nations. You know what we are? We're all the nations. The only good thing we've got is we're part of the bride. The Spirit of God moves in. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me, not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. But verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem. We've read about this already in Jeremiah and Zephaniah and Joel. All nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken. So at first it's going to look really bad for the Jew. And their houses rifled, the women ravished, and half the city shall go into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth Remember, he said, like a prey. He said, watch me. I'm determined, like I'm rising up to my prey. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, the whole bunch of them, as when he fought in the day of battle. And then verse 4, one of the neatest verses, I can hardly wait to see this. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And if you've ever seen the pictures we've shown, go out the eastern gate that the Muslims blocked up, and there's the valley, the Kidron Valley. They're not a big valley like the valley here from those mountains to those mountains. It's very small. You could almost throw a rock across. It's a steep little valley there, just one road right in the middle. And over here is the Garden of Gethsemane, and over here is the Mount of Olives where Jesus prayed looking over Jerusalem. And Jesus' feet are going to go on the Mount of Olives. Verse 4, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst. That means it's going to cut right in half. And in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountains shall remove toward the north, and half toward the south. Remember, hold your place, in Acts chapter 1, the Lord descends up into heaven, and the disciples are standing there gazing like anybody with a brain would when a guy floats away. And the angel shows up and says, why stand you here gazing? This same Jesus whom you've seen, he's going to come again, just like you saw him. This is what we're reading about right here. This is Acts chapter 1. He's going to come back, feet going to hit the Mount of Olives, split it this way, toss it that way, a giant valley and a river. And we talked about this a couple years ago, a wonderful river of life flowing right out of the temple. Incredible story, can't get to that. But look at verse 2. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem. And look at verse 3. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations. Go down to verse 11. And all men shall dwell in it, and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. And I'll skip all that in between. I'm blurring a lot here, but let me explain. Why don't you flip my lights off? Let's look at this once more. Now, John 14, you all know it. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I'll come again. And what? Receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. That's where, somewhere up there in the north, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north. There's a heavenly Jerusalem, Revelation 19 talks about. We're going to be caught up together and meet the Lord in the clouds, and we're going to be in heaven. And it's Revelation chapter 4. He heard the voice like the sound of a trumpet that said, come up hither and I'll show thee things to come. That's the picture where the church will be. And then the tribulation opens, and all the vials and all the trumpet judgments and all these things going on. And you get toward the end of all that, and God's going to begin to gather all these nations. And they're all going to gather right there from all over. The military of the world is going to gather right there in that little spot. And God's going to plead for his people. He's going to step up and say, my people have hurt long enough at your hands. All the way back from Haman and days of Esther to Hitler, all through the Inquisitions where people calling themselves crusaders murdered countless millions of people. Muslims killed the Jews, the Catholics killed the Jews, the Romans killed the Jews. And God says, I'm going to pour my wrath on all nations. And he said he's going to burn. If you summarize all those verses, he's going to burn them up. Now, think intellectually. What's left? One little spot of people and one city up there. You know what's great about this? There's only two groups of people going to be left. The bride and the seed of Abraham. Now you can differ with me on that. When we get there, I'll say, I told you so. But when we get to the end of all this, God promised Abraham this earth. God said, this is your home. Say, what about all the other good people? They're either going to be Jews or they're going to be believers. It's only two kinds of people are going to make it. And I love that I'm going to be a part. I'm going to be in the palace of the king. And Abraham's seed can have the earth. I've had enough of it. I'm looking for my heavenly city. You know what's great is God made, where we started, God made a covenant with Isaac forever. You know, when you got saved, you know what you got? I will never leave thee. You got an eternal covenant. I'll never leave thee nor forsake thee. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish. August 28, 1975, in a city park, when I bowed my head and trusted Christ, there was an eternal covenant made with Bruce Goddard. Man, make some stupid mistakes. God whooped me. God frustrated with me, whatever God does. But you know what? I am going when that trumpet sounds. And until then, you know what? Who cares? Let's just love people. Let's get people saved. Let's love the broken, and let's pick up the hurting, and because everything's okay. Father, bless us. And we're grateful that